Hello, everyone. I've just been told that we're live. My name is Philip Young. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm here in California where it's incredibly hot. It's about 102 right now. So this is a perfect topic, climate change, that we have for this particular session. I'm now the new president and CEO of World Affairs. Been here now about 7 or 8 months. I wanted to welcome you. A big project of ours is the Global Philanthropy Forum, which many of you are all very familiar with. It's just around the corner. It's going to be in mid-September. And the topic for that, again, is going to be climate change. And in preparation for that, we thought we're starting off with a series of webinars to try to get people up to speed, to get them thinking about the issues that we're going to be talking about. And so just for you to know, to make sure that you're in the right session, the topic for today that we're going to, in this webinar session, is COVID-19, climate change, and imagining a new normal. And we're really happy to have our panelists who I'll introduce a little more thoroughly a little bit later. Joanne Messing of the Girl Family Fund, Amy Loers of Future Earth, and Beth Sarwin of Climate Interactive. So I thought I would just preface a little bit in terms of what we're doing here and the conference and the panel here. So when we thought about this, obviously we're right in the middle of a pandemic, and I think that when we look back, history will likely divide the time that we have, this time period, as pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. Right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and with that, the pandemic has brought the world, in a sense, to a standstill. We have pandemic, economic depression, and social unrest. And yet, in the midst of crisis and in the midst of the pandemic, because we're not post-COVID-19 at this point, there's always opportunity. And we're thinking about what are those opportunities. And one of the things that we're thinking about in preparation for for GPF is, what can the post-COVID-19 world look like if we mobilize collectively and smartly? And the question we've been asking ourselves is, especially, what does that mean for the challenge of climate change? Personally, having been in Washington and where we are right now, unfortunately, I think there's little that we can expect from the United States because of the partisan gridlock. And arguably, we're going to be in partisan gridlock for a very long time. All of us know that the Paris Climate Agreement without the United States is really an ambitious effort to achieve near net zero emissions. And because of pandemic, it seems that the international efforts have been stymied and completely disrupted. So what we have here then is really a set of gaps left by national, in terms of the US, and international efforts. And so it seems to me this is what, the question that we're asking ourselves is, what can philanthropy and civil society do? I think one indicator, which I think our panelists will allude to, is the notion that is the hope that there is hope for climate change in the midst of pandemic. And I think what people are pointing to is the CO2 emissions that have dropped significantly this year. In some places in Asia that I know, residents can see blue sky where there was haze and brown. And yet, even with the massive drop in CO2 emissions this year, there's still concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere that won't stabilize until the planet reaches net zero. So this is the challenge, this is the context. And yet, I think as I step back a little bit, one of the things that I think about is what makes the challenge of climate change so daunting, even now in this pandemic, is that because of all the things that are happening to us right now, it's really difficult to visualize what a more stable world will look like. It's hard for us to imagine that. And in certain ways, some people or critics would say there's a failure of imagination. But what we're really fortunate for us right now is to help us think this through, and to raise issues for us to think about at GPF. We've got people who've got incredible imagination, and they've got certain kinds of perspectives that I think will serve us well as we as we start leading to GPF next month. We've got Joanna Messing, who's the ED Executive Director of the Girl Family Fund, And this fund is a high-impact philanthropic fund investing in the rapid transition to a clean energy future. Joanna convenes and bridges funders and NGOs. I think there are a lot of people in our audience there. And what I noted about her writings and her speaking engagements is that she's very much about specific on-the-ground actions. And I think one thing that she will talk about is this notion about coal is key. So for her, it's very specific in the way she's looking at, very action-oriented. We also have Amy Loers, who's the executive director of Future Earth. Future Earth is a network of scientists and innovators that come up with evidence-based policy solutions. I first met Amy when she was at the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and I've known, and she's worked on climate issues for a very long time and was at the Obama White House. The thing about Amy, and I think as a thing that follows through with her from her time at Skoll, is that what she talks about a lot, or a big part of what she talks about, is mobilizing advocacy networks. I think what she said was, in one thing, was focus on people, not carbon. And then finally, we have Beth Sarwin. She's the co-director and co-founder of Climate Interactive, a nonprofit think tank that was hatched at MIT. Beth is an expert of solutions that address climate change through systemic simulations and modeling. And her writing is somewhat philosophical. That's the way I would describe it. She talks about practical dreamers. And I think what she has written about that I found very compelling is about the ability to change mindsets, to think about the world in a different way. So we're very excited to have you all here. Thank you for being with us. For those of you in the audience, a little bit of logistics. We're going to do a round robin where I'll ask some questions, and we'll do that for about 30 minutes or so. And then if you have in your Zoom box, you have a question Q&A box, which I can then go to at some point towards the end of that 30 minutes and then just ask those questions. So as you think about questions, please go ahead and type them in. So let's start with an opening question for all. It's an opportunity for you to introduce yourselves and work. So here's the question. So taking on climate change can feel like, an incredible daunting task, especially in the midst of so much unrest and uncertainty brought on by COVID-19 and the social issues like Black Lives Matter protests. How have each of you in your work had to reprioritize and adjust your strategy? And what's different and not different from a year ago today from your perspective? So why don't we start with Joanna on that, please?
Sure, thank you. And thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a very important and timely topic for us all to be thinking about. Climate change is a topic which can seem overwhelming even pre-COVID and pre the economic and social unrest that we're in. However, at the same point, one of the things that we've actually realized is that while it can seem overwhelmingly complex, there's also a devastating simplicity to it as well, which is that the vast majority of climate change is caused by burning things, by burning coal, oil, gas, and trees. And if we're really going to make the transformation to shift to a climate friendly reality, we have to transform the way that we power our society. And so we have been thinking about power and how we power our societies, and that remains the same. However, what we see is that there's an increased urgency and an unparalleled opportunity. We've been making a significant amount of progress. Ember just put out a new report today that showed wind and solar electricity has hit 10% of global electricity, which is double since 2015. So on the one hand, that is news that we should be cheering. And on the other hand, it's simply far too slow. I mean, if you look at the charts of how we get our electricity sector in line with climate reality, it means transitioning off of coal in the OECD by 2030 and the rest of the world by 2040 and replacing it with clean energy. So we have to act faster and more ambitious than ever. I think some of the other things that have really come forward in this last 6 months is the disproportionate impact of COVID and air pollution and climate impacts on underrepresented communities, particularly Black, Brown, and poor communities, not only in the US, but internationally. And so that is an intersection that we are really keenly aware of. The opportunities that I would point out are really around step change. As we were looking at things a year ago, one of the things that was so frustrating and challenging was the way that people were looking at things in an incremental way. But now that our approach, our entire societies have been cracked open, we have the opportunity to actually look at things in the step change and ambitious way that we need to. So I can talk more about our particular strategy, but I would say that that's really the opportunity of the moment, is to look at the intersection between impacted communities, between air pollution and energy, and to really think at the scale and speed of ambition that's required with these new stimulus packages.
Okay, great, thank you. Amy?
Great, thanks so much. It's great to be here. I think the first thing I would say about the importance of this, unprecedented moment is that, if we look at what the scientific community has been projecting for many years, the COVID-19 crisis is just one example of the global systemic crisis that have been predicted. So it sort of appears like it's a black swan, but it really isn't. It's something that has been projected in various different forms. And as you know, Philip, I did work with Larry Brilliant on ending pandemics, and this is something that we discussed quite a bit. And there are similar global systemic crises emerging from the confluence of climate, water, biodiversity, and politics that are also have been projected in various different scenarios. And so it really highlights, I think, the point of the importance of listening to those scenarios, listening to what the science says, the importance of rethinking and on a regular basis what is on the horizon, because the risks that we face are so complex, so ambiguous, and so hard to model in sort of predictable ways, that we know exactly when will something happen, but we have to understand the trends that are on the horizon and be able to respond and be prepared for them. And so I think that's one, as someone who's worked in the scientific community on these issues, is just a really stark reality that we have to face. And related to that, though, it obviously also highlights how interdependent we all are in addressing those global systemic challenges, and how interdependent and interconnected we are, both through the natural but also the digital world. And I think recognizing those as integrated and interconnected parts of our resilience or fragility is an important thing in terms of strategies moving forward. And of course, it also highlighted the deep social inequities, and how not only that those are there, but those inequities are making us all vulnerable. So hopefully can it help us recognize the importance of working together and addressing inequities as part of addressing the climate challenge. It's of course also illustrating to us how rapidly we can mobilize resources. $9 trillion, I think, is the total estimate of stimulus packages. When we think about what we've said about how much it would cost to address the climate challenge, and this can be mobilized so quickly, obviously this climate issue has not been put as much of an urgency on the table as it needs to be, because we can address that with these challenges. Now, the good news is that there is that $9 trillion, and some of that can be directed to addressing these challenges. And I think there is optimism that can be done. I wanted to just close in the context of thinking about what's different now. Two things. One is one of the areas that I've been working on a great deal is focusing on sustainability in the digital age, with the idea that to achieve the Paris Agreement targets and the Sustainable Development Targets more broadly, there's been a very clear representation, articulation that what we need is broad and deep scale societal transformations. And I think one thing that we've seen certainly prior to the COVID crisis is that one of the drivers of those societal transformations is the digital revolution, digital transformations. Not all of those are heading in the way that we want. Sometimes those are creating challenges for society. But what I would say is that they are driving rapid and unprecedented scale changes that are ones that I think we do have to leverage to be able to address these challenges of sustainability. And how we do that, once we were engaged in this work prior to COVID, and once COVID happened, we sort of took a pause. But then people started to reach out to us because the recognition is that this is true even more now, and rethinking what does it mean to for climate governance in the digital age. I think there's a sort of a need to think about that in a more holistic way.
Thank you. So, Beth, I think Amy talked about interconnectedness, interdependence, and inequities. I mean, in your work, all those things are very relevant. So maybe go ahead and take on the question there. I think she's teed it up for you very well.
Yeah, thank you. At Climate Interactive, our work falls into two different buckets, I'd say. One is computer simulations about climate change that help people ask what-if questions about how to address this issue. So how has that work changed since the pandemic? The main thing I would highlight is that we've had to very quickly learn how to use a tool like that virtually. A lot of the uses of our simulations typically would be like someone engaging a group of people in person. So now we're having to support our users to do that virtually. And of course, everyone around the world is retooling in a similar way. But I want to highlight the potential for climate change because of course it is a global problem. Of course, we can't solve it individually. And tools like ours help people see the full picture, both across sectors and across geographies. And it's been really sort of touching and amazing when we do a webinar to train people using this tool, you know, across every time zone, every continent, different age groups, different sectors, people using these tools both to educate and advocate. And so it is a really hard moment. Absolutely want to acknowledge that. So much unnecessary loss. And it also is a potential moment for coming together. And I think we need to celebrate all the places where that's happening. So the second part of our work is about how that coming together can happen. We work with an approach that we call multi-solving, which is the opposite of focusing only on greenhouse gases. It says, let's take into account the potential for jobs, the potential for health from improved air quality, the potential for resilience, and particularly for building equity. And I'd say that aspect of our work hasn't changed at all, except perhaps becoming more important. Because when you're in a moment of intersecting crises, of course, you can't afford to tackle them one by one. You have to find ways to tackle them together. And I think we'll talk more about this in the hour, but one thing I would hold up is the power of networks for doing that. A lot of our projects were based on a strategy of bringing people together across sectors and silos to take action on these multiple intersecting issues. And what I'm seeing in response to the crisis is how quickly a network can pivot. So in a time of uncertainty, if your strategy was a very clearly focused on one objective, that might be irrelevant now in this time of COVID. But a network that you've built can be very quickly redirected. And so those investments in trust and mutual understanding, those are sort of no regrets investments in a time of uncertainty, I would say.
So Beth, let's just continue with you, and then I'll go over to Joanna in a second about you know, sort of what they're doing right now and in specifically. But you know, I looked at your website. I mean, it's sort of interesting, this modeling exercise. Can you tell us, you know, in your mind concretely, so what are the things in your mind, are we doing right? I mean, you referred to networking and being able to pivot. Are there things that come to mind that you see that is really that is making a difference that we wouldn't otherwise be doing?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll tell a couple specific stories just to get to that
Yeah.
question. So one of them that I've learned a lot from is a collaboration we have in Atlanta with an organization called Partnership for Southern Equity. So they are experts, particularly in the American South, about issues around equity. And for almost 4 years now, we've been building a network together in Atlanta at the intersection of health and climate, jobs, social justice, and housing. What that looks like in practice is bringing people together once a month, every other month, to explore these intersections and to do work together. And we're going to have a meeting, in fact, tomorrow. One of the things on the agenda is to address the eviction crisis, which of course is looming for all of the US right now. And that was not an initial necessarily focus of this work. We were focused on gentrification, how that intersects with clean energy investment and green space investment. But we never anticipated a pandemic, right? We never anticipated an eviction crisis on this scale. And so I think that's a really good example. And because I know so many in the audience here are funders who are asking yourself, what does it mean to be strategic in a time of uncertainty? Experiences like this just really convince me that funding relationships, funding just the time and space for people to build that trust and mutual understanding, that's an investment that you don't have to know what the future is going to bring. That's an investment that can be focused on a moment of opportunity or turned to play defense, depending on what happens. So that's one thing I'd say we're doing right. I would really highlight that. The second thing is that very early in the COVID-19 crisis, my colleagues and I got interested, as many people are, in the recovery packages and the stimulus packages on the table, because we saw, and many people are saying this, that trillions of dollars are going to be invested, which could lock in carbon emissions and inequity and poor health, or could lock in a very low carbon infrastructure and do it in an equitable way. There's many great efforts tracking this. We're focusing on a really specific slice of it, which is what are the efforts at all scales? So we're looking at cities, states, and nations that meet 3 criteria. So what are the efforts that help with economic recovery, that are low carbon or are somehow addressing climate change, and are equitable? And I think it's that third one that makes what we're tracking, a pretty specific subset. Unfortunately, I'd say we don't have a great dollar figure, but it's definitely not the majority of the trillions of dollars we're talking about. But each of these examples is a proof of concept of what could happen. And I think is another huge place to try and both learn and replicate and inspire. And is there time, Philip, for a couple examples from that? Or
yeah, really quickly. Yeah, just quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are on our website, which is climateinteractive.org. So go check them out. A city example: Burlington, Vermont's municipal electric utility has a green stimulus, and it has things that are focused on the most vulnerable members of that community, like home weatherization, access to solar, electric vehicles. Germany has a huge investment. A huge part of their stimulus package is focused on climate. It has many equity provisions at the same time. Nigeria is doing electrification of communities that didn't have energy security. So that's a specific part of their stimulus package, COVID-19, but it's hitting poverty and it's hitting clean energy all at the same time. And so everywhere we look, we see these examples, but a small fraction of what they could be.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Joanna, so as a climate funder, I mean, again, going on this theme about interconnectedness, interdependence, what have you, we talked about this a little bit about your learning as a funder about pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and climate change, and how has that focused in your part in terms of your focus as a foundation on, as you said, emissions, right, itself, and your decisions related to that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And what I would say is, though we are climate funders, and that's where we are entering in terms of our mission and the primary impact that we are are tracking, we also really understand and see the complexity of the political, social, and economic systems that we're in, and that we're not going to reach our climate goals from a technical fix. We also see the threat, as Beth pointed out, of the stimulus potentially locking in high carbon when we have the opportunity to use it for low carbon and equitable futures. And so when we think about our own grant making, I mean, part of the context is we're a venture philanthropy organization, which means that we support startup and early stage organizations and new and innovative ideas. So this is actually a great time for us because we really need some new ideas and new thinking. And I think part of what both Amy and Beth were talking about is when you support leaders who are from impacted communities and you support new organizations and approaches, it allows them to pivot with the time and energy rather than locking into a specific project. So that's been a really important part of what we're doing, and particularly focusing on how can we diversify our grant-making portfolio and ensure that our practices are really reaching out to a new set of grantees. We work internationally, so the Black Lives Matter moment is relevant for some countries more than others, but the issue of racial and social justice and ensuring that our grant dollars support organizations that are from the communities that are being impacted is absolutely a theme and topic that we've been watching and will continue to watch even more. I think the other piece of this is that a lot of times organizations on the ground are not necessarily self-identifying as climate. Sometimes people are looking at air pollution or land rights or other related issues, which end up having impacts on climate because it ends up determining how the communities choose the energy choices. And has a whole set of co-benefits of clean air and clean water and equity that we're really keeping an eye on. And that's why we find it so important to make sure that we're supporting communities and leaders from the communities who can come up with the solutions that are really required and the vision for their own community and future.
Great. Amy, for you, we had talked about something, I mean, again, going along the lines of what I said before was the focus on people and movements and networks is some of what you're doing. I know that you all have done a very interesting set of surveys to get a sense of the body politic. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that and share your key findings. I'm sure people would be fascinated with those.
Yeah, so thanks for asking. So we, just to provide context here, we pretty quickly after things hit here, if you will, in North America, I'm actually based in Montreal, we put out a global survey and with the idea of recognizing this was a moment in time which was not even recognizing how historic it would be, that it might be a good thing to sort of take a pulse of the world as we move through this period. How are people experiencing it? What is their perceptions on risks and, you know, hope and so forth? And one of the reasons this was spurred is that just several months ago now, in January or in February, we released a global risk perception report that looked at how people in the scientific community were viewing risks. This wasn't just the scientific community, this was broadly. We did it globally around the world. And a couple of things, you know, there were questions about expectations, about hopes, and some very specifics about actions as well. And also where people thought we would head in terms of a sustainable trajectory. And we've done 2 of these. We're doing them every 3 months. So we've done 2 so far. The first one went out April 1st, and the last one just in July. So we're going to do one in October 1st. And it is kind of interesting. A couple of things of note. One thing that was very clear is the people who expected more sustainable outcomes, like that's the trajectory we will emerge from this. they all were associated with a decrease in economic interdependence. So more sort of localized economic growth, that would be the response. So that was sort of a pattern that emerged that was interesting. The other is that in general, the respondents from the global south expected that the trajectory in the coming years would be towards reduced inequality, but increased ecological footprints. Another sort of interesting fact that sort of emerged from these, and another one that was true across all sectors, all regions, that was very powerful, like a very strong signal, is the expectation that there'll be an increased digital surveillance. But the other aspect of that we explored was how people felt about that. So we asked, how do you feel about the role of digital surveillance if it can save lives in this context, in emergencies like the coronavirus? And again, most people, significantly more than the majority, across regions and across sectors, were supportive of that, really significantly more than the majority. We then asked, though, are you comfortable using digital surveillance in support of crises like climate? And what was shocking to me is actually that a large proportion said yes. And I was not expecting that. I'm not sure exactly how I would respond to that. But what the presentation was in the context of things like if there was a individualized carbon budget. And so that, I thought there was some variations in global north versus global south on that, which would less supportive, but still more supported than not. In Europe and North America, there was a little bit less support than you found in other regions. So it is kind of interesting to think about, what that variation is. Those are just a few highlights, but how that might shape the narrative and the dialogues of options. Because another thing that, of course, is coming out of this moment in time is things that were never possible to have on the table are all of a sudden coming on the table as people are thinking about new ideas. And that's one that sort of surprised me. Yes, I actually put the question on there because I thought it would be interesting, but I didn't expect the result that we got. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
So, Amy, let's follow up on that, because I think what you talk about, what I love about, my experience has been in diplomacy, and sometimes in diplomacy, people think there's no way, entrenched interest, but the more you just start talking with each other, it opens up possibilities that people didn't imagine were there. That's sort of the creative process.
Right.
Again, you talked about narratives, and storytelling is really important. So how, what do you think this could mean? I mean, the social movements that are going on, how can, maybe a direct question is, how can people who are focused on climate change, how can they take advantage of the sudden social consciousness and people, and particularly young people, really pressing to do things? They're going out on the street. What's your reaction? Is there, what can be done there, or what are you thinking about in those terms?
Well, it's interesting because, as I'm sure the other people on this call, on this webinar get too, I often get how do you keep optimistic in the context of the kinds of work that you do, and I do say now that what keeps me optimistic is the youth, is the energy and, determination of the youth. They're engaged. And it helps that I have an 18-year-old, so he's right out there, and I'm really excited to see him so engaged in the world. But I think that as we think now, everybody is being creative. Well, how can you keep that power of that was really growing and obviously reemerged in the context of Black Lives Matter and really came out again. But how can you keep that moving in this new world that we're in, and thinking innovatively about those sorts of connections and power of that connection and building that those momentum in a digital space that stays connected to also, you know, not just with each other in isolation with the planet, but together with the planet. I think there's a lot of creativity. I'm sure this might be something, actually, the kinds of things that Beth thinks about in engaging with her work. And, you know, even in the context of the really localized effort, the connection of you know, connection of sort of multi-stakeholder approaches, not just to social movements, but to engaging in more participatory, deliberative governance processes, I think is a direction that this could open up in a way that it was already bubbling up, but might emerge as even more powerful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Beth, so let's talk a couple of things. I mean, these are so opposite. I mean, one of the things I'm struck about you is when I think about modeling and I think about simulators, I think about a lot of quantitative work, right? I think about having these inputs, sort of this black box that people go into and then something comes out. So that's one aspect of your work, which I'd like you to, you know, again, elaborate on so that people have a sense of that too. But the other thing that's been struck by me about your writing is that there's a very qualitative aspect that you are talking about and have written about, which is completely changing our mindset about capitalism, growth. You know, what's, you know, our mode is constant growth. Is that even necessary? So I'm wondering how you reconcile that and how that kind of goes into maybe your modeling in certain ways.
Yeah, those are great questions to think about. I'm not sure where to start. I'll start actually with my mentor. So I had the great good fortune as a young scientist to work with Donella Meadows, who some people on the call might know. She was one of the authors of the 1972 study, The Limits to Growth, which was the first real look at the moment we're in now, right? Which is the human ecological footprint surpassing the carrying capacity of the planet and what would happen. The analytic method that the Limits to Growth used is the same analytic method that our computer models use. So the software has evolved over almost 50 years, but the mathematics is basically the same. And so that whole sort of intellectual trajectory that I come from was based on this question of you know, you cannot sustain infinite growth on a finite planet. In 1972, we had a lot of choices and we could have avoided a lot of the suffering and loss that we're going through right now. But there's still an enormous amount of choice before us, right? Even in this moment when it is so fraught and we're feeling climate impacts. I see one of the Q&A questions is about immigration. We're seeing climate refugees around the world. So if you stay with your science long enough, you know, you're brought to the human being and our choices about who we want to be and how we want to organize ourselves. At the end of the day, and I think Joanna said this too, that although there's a lot of technical things we have to get right, at the end of the day, the questions that we're really facing aren't technical ones. They're about what do we owe to each other? What do we owe to future generations? And how do we want to make good lives for ourselves? And so, yeah, I go back and forth. I have a mind that was trained to do the math. But one of the things Donella Meadows taught me was the math just actually brings you to these bigger questions, and you have to find ways to help people grapple with them. And in fact, that's what we use our simulations for, because they allow people to ask what if questions and then project simulated futures, but they don't tell us what to do. You know, that is up to the human heart. It's up to our ethics. And we need this interplay. And for me, when the science and the mathematics and the ethics all line up, you know, and they all give kind of the same answer, which is we need to share, we can't have growth forever. You know, that's mathematically true, and it's also ethically true. And those are the places, you know, that I see, like, yes, forward movement in that direction.
So I'm curious, was there, in your simulations, was there anything, was there a insight that came about along those lines among your participants at all, in that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's as many insights with our simulations as there are people to play with them, right? So it's hard to, but some of the most common insights.
What surprised, maybe what surprised you the most? What was an insight that surprised you the most? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot here. If there's one, that's great, but is there something
Yeah.
that comes to mind?
Well, the biggest surprise of my career actually was after spending practically 15 years focused with laser-like focus on greenhouse gas emissions and modeling them. One day I asked my team the question of what else would get better in the world if we got off of fossil fuels. And I had a researcher who went off and she brought me back a report, and it talked about the health benefits. This was probably close to 10 years ago. It talked about the health benefits, the job benefits, the potential social equity benefits, and wherever she could, she put a dollar value on those benefits. So she put the report on my desk, and it said that the benefits were worth the same amount of money it was going to cost to get on a path to protect the climate. So I had been working for close to 15 years, like, it's really hard, everyone, but we have to make this big sacrifice for the good of the future. And here's this report that said, and it will pay for itself. And I actually asked her to go back and look at the numbers. I mean, now we know that was absolutely right. In 2018, the World Health Organization wrote a report that said the same thing. They said the cost of meeting the Paris goals will be offset by the health co-benefits. But in around 2007, I didn't know that. And that totally changed how I looked at my work, where I saw the opportunities. And it's still one of the woefully misunderstood things about climate change. That World Health Organization report came out in the same week that the IPCC 1.5 report came out, which got so much attention and was so devastating because it told us how big the gap was between safety and where we're headed. And then there was this, basically the World Health Organization handing us the map of how to get there, how to save ourselves. But many people miss that report. So I talk about it whatever chance I get.
Okay, thank you. So Joanna, we talked about, let's kind of go back and put your other hat on instead of as an investor, but philanthropy generally. We had you're pretty passionate about what the role of funders needs to be right now. I mean, economies, some of them are starting to recover. They're actually trying to think about, the fallout of COVID-19, again, post-COVID-19, but we're still in the middle of this. What are funders' responsibilities now in a green recovery? I mean, the decisions we make now can have huge effects when we get into this post-COVID-19 world. And I know you have very strong feelings about that.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I mean, I think there's a really important role for philanthropy right now. Obviously, when you talk about the sums of money that are on the table, philanthropy is never going to equal the amount of money that can be catalyzed by corporations and governments. So I always see our role as catalyzing, both through diplomacy and policy, as well as through pilots, and also, frankly, through supporting people power to put pressure on the governments and corporations to walk the walk and make the difference. We all know that the fossil fuel lobby is out in force. So part of our role is to counter that narrative about the economic stimulus opportunity that we face. And I love a lot of the things that Beth said about the ability for co-benefits that communities have viewed for the first time in many places, a glimpse of clean air. And so how can we use that imagination to say this is actually the future that we want for our children? I think the supporting voices of mothers about our children and how we want, what is the future that we are looking for our children. And so for philanthropy, again, I think there's a real role in terms of supporting innovators, supporting organizations and leaders, and building the organizations and infrastructure around them. Philanthropy has a bad habit of doing just projects or one-year funding. And in this moment, I think it's really critical that we provide core organizational support to help organizations through this time so that they're not worried about their paychecks or laying people off, but they're instead thinking about how to maximize this moment. I also think it's a really important time for us as philanthropists to think about how we dig deep. I'm very grateful to our trustees who a couple of years ago decided to invest beyond the interest and dig into their principal, because they saw that this is a moment. And boy, if it was a moment a couple of years ago, I mean, right now, if you're saving for a rainy day, I mean, it is pouring. So I think now is the time to do things like what Ford and some of their other partners have looked at and really consider innovative ways to get more funding out into the field. I also think it's really important for us as philanthropy to take this moment and look at the way that we grant, the way that we staff ourselves. Black Lives Matter and the social justice moment has really shown a particularly harsh light on the environmental and climate movement, and really looking at what are the networks that we're supporting, who are the grantees that we're supporting, how do we ensure that we're really diversifying our support. And that's important not just from an equity perspective, but also from an impact perspective. So I have a lot of other thoughts about this, but I'll stop there.
Well,
Those are the highlights.
That's very commendable, because I think there are similar conversations that were going on in 2008 when the market crashed, and I think you saw a lot of foundations stepping back as well and cutting, and then there were others who decided they wanted to move forward in a very substantial way. I mean, can you give us a flavor then for some of our listeners who are funders, perhaps, of the kind of conversation that you're having with the trustees? I mean, right now they seem all in. You feel comfortable being able to move forward in all this. Is that right?
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Okay.
And I think the conversation that we've been having with other trustees as well is, how can you push the borders of your comfort zone because of the moment that we're in. And of course, it's tempting to be conservative in this moment and to protect and preserve. But what are you protecting and preserving for if the climate falls apart, if our social contract falls apart? I mean, we have a moment now where we can actually make decisions that will have a long-term impact. If we really do go for that future that Beth talked about, we're really at a tipping point. And so I do encourage foundations and other philanthropists to think about how to really be bold. And it's hard because, all of our due diligence practices, we always go and do an in-person site visit. No, we can't do that. So, it's very, very tempting to say, let's just pull back and wait for some more certainty, and then we'll start writing the checks again. But what I'd be really encouraging people to do is think about how to absorb some additional risk with the potential for upside that there is right now. So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having. Each foundation has to understand its own limits. But I think the final point that I would say is the more that we can talk together as the philanthropic community, the more that we can leverage each other and really say, okay, if you're going to be more conservative, that's fine, but maybe could you pick up these grants that we have because they're a little more conservative, and then that gives us the space to be a little bit more risky. So I'm really encouraging more and more conversations and networking among funders to think about ourselves as a philanthropic capital market and how can we collectively meet this moment.
Okay, I've been remiss. I just wanted to remind our listeners, you have the Q&A function. So if you have questions that you want to address specifically to our panel, that would be great. We have a couple here. There was one, I think you all, both the panel has seen, about immigration, connection of climate change and immigration. And the questioner was specifically from Central America, given all that we're seeing right now with COVID there too. I'm wondering, maybe Joanna and possibly Amy. I don't know, Beth, if you've done a simulation, but there's a question here specifically for you. So why don't we, Joanna, you want to take a crack? I mean, Amy, you want to take a crack at that? Is that something?
Well, I think, generally, certainly the prospect of more mass migrations and movement of people as a result of the changing climate is something that we will expect. The specifics of what that looks like in Central America and Latin America, I don't have the sort of data on me offhand, but certainly across the board as one of the sort of trends in the climate changes that we see is places that are dry get drier, places that are wet get wetter. And so in those extreme areas, the livelihoods of certain regions will sort of become very vulnerable, and will push people out. And I think what we're also seeing is, and kind of reflecting amount in the times today, is the connectivity of events, not changes in one place, but those things that happen in one part of the world and another part of the world and another part of the world, and they're all interconnected, that will lead to surprises. And I think that the projections here are that those surprises will be connected with the mass movements of people. So I think that is something that we not only have to concern ourselves with, because in terms of sort of projecting in the future and how we address them, but recognize that some of those in the decades to come are not something we can have. We're committed to some changes, and some of those changes are underway, and we have to realize that dealing with this crisis now is not just about incrementally reducing emissions. It's about getting to net zero and maybe net negative. It's about recognizing that changes are underway, even if we start reducing those, because we've waited so long to take action. And so we have to be prepared for those kinds of changes ahead.
Okay, thanks. Joanne, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Amy really covered the point.
Okay,
There's
great.
a beautiful article in New York Times that I'll look for the link to, about the link between heat and inequality. And I think it's really important. The only other point I would say is it links to the equity issues before, is that people who are most impacted tend to be those who have the most to lose already, and also who have contributed least to the climate change issues. So we do face a perfect storm, and I absolutely expect to see more immigration issues.
Yeah, and then the whole notion of COVID-19 and pandemic being exacerbated by climate for a variety of reasons, I think is really important. So for Beth, one question, someone, to your point about mathematics, science, and ethics being, and being consistent, how might we encourage science to claim its agency in envisioning preferred futures and negotiating how to embody those preferred futures in the material world?
Yeah, well, I think that's a question that science really is grappling with. There's kind of a myth of the scientist as being apolitical, and I've been really influenced by scientists who take that on and say, we all have our worldviews, we have our mental models, we come out of institutions with worldviews, and what you need to do is examine them and reveal them and be explicit about them. So that's one thing I would stress, is science is political, own it and own up to it. A corollary of that is, to make space in the field of science beyond the usual suspects. So there's indigenous science, there's native ways of knowing, there's indigenous knowledge systems that often, don't have resources and support and funding or a role in decision making. There's citizen science. So broaden the definition of who gets to be a scientist, and use your privilege, if you are one, to make space for others. And then, the last thing I would say is for scientists to try to live their lives as though they really believe what their science is telling them. And so for me, that looks like my family tries to grow most of its own food. We live in a pretty green house. We have an electric car. None of these things alone are going to solve climate change, and the biggest levers aren't individual, they're systemic. But at the same time, the dissonance of scientists who don't embody what their science is telling them, I think really confuses people. So to try to do an honest inventory of your own, how you show up, I think is worth considering.
Okay, so we're gonna have one last question for all three of you that's similar, and I think I want to incorporate the question that Eileen posed, and it has to do. Each couple minutes a piece, and then we'll wrap up a little after one. I apologize for being a little later. The question generally is, what does a successful green recovery look like when we get to post-COVID-19 or post-COVID-19? And the difficulty has always been status quo, vested interest in what exists right now. How are we going to overcome that in certain ways? And maybe if you can incorporate that flavor into it, if you think it's relevant or not. And you've got about maybe a minute and a half each to tell us, really quickly, sort of your vision and what it looks like. Why don't we start with Amy? Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So I guess one of the things I wanted to, in that context of what the vision looks like, I wanted to circle back to a point that you started with, Philip, about the fact that this crisis has led to a steep drop in emissions, and it is true. The projection is for the annual will be about 8% lower than last year, and at a peak it was something like 17% lower. I want to highlight, though, that that's actually a blip, right? The reality is that it's yes, it's nice to see that it can happen that quickly. My perspective is actually it's shocking that it didn't go down further, in the sense of it shows how deeply rooted the structures that run our society are, that it didn't go down, and basically the world went on hold. So I think that one thing I think that in thinking about what a green recovery looks like is recognizing that the challenge isn't an 8%, yes, if we could keep 8% going, it's a structural and institutional change that we really have to make deeply to get to net zero in 30 years. And even maybe net negative in 30 years. And that, remembering that that's the challenge, and the pieces that I think that would come out of this in the context of this is really the ability to think about new ideas, things that were not off the table. Let's not lose that moment. And, before we get out of this and go back to a new normal, let that new normal be new ideas. Part of that is changing behaviors. There's a lot of investment in the context of infrastructure and the trillions of dollars. Part of that has to be recognizing that this has shaken up our behavior. I am one of those who traveled all over the world, and I am thrilled not to be traveling all the time, and I am accepting that as part of my life for sure. But then supply chains and infrastructure, of course, that idea of thinking about more resilient supply chains and what does that mean for our carbon footprint and the infrastructure. But finally, I really want to highlight this issue of the digital sector. I think we really need to think about the governing of the digital world and the natural world as integrated pieces of getting us through this process. And there are a lot of challenging questions right there now, because there's social and political and ethical issues that we have to face, but I think these are interconnected.
Okay, thank you. Joanne?
Sure. So it's a big question. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of what Amy said is exactly right. We need to really look at the systems and structures of what we're doing, not resting everything on individual change, though of course individual change is critical. And I think that in that, one of the ways that we look at this is looking at sector transformation, particularly the electricity sector transformation. So and we see that as being a critical part of this next wave, not only because the electricity sector right now is overly responsible for its own CO2 emissions, but also because the decarbonization pathways for transport and buildings and industry tend to be #electrify everything. And so therefore we need to make sure that we take this opportunity to get the electricity sector right. And as it relates to the question about transition, I think one of the key pieces of transformation is what is the utility business model of the future? What are the kinds of jobs of the future? What are the kinds of ways that energy is going to be delivered in the future? What kinds of jobs can also be created to clean up the utility model of the past? And how can we use this opportunity when we are open to more government stimulus to clean up the messes that were left by the fossil fuel industry and transform into the next wave? And how can we also subsidize that transition for people, knowing that some individuals will lose their jobs, though overall, as a society, we will gain more jobs and better jobs by the transition to clean energy economy. So I feel like we have a moment where we can actually look at this a little bit more holistically, particularly since in the past we really waited on private finance, but now with so much public sector investment, we can really actually weigh in the broader economics. I also think when you look at this at a global scale, there are some economies that have an oversized number of decisions that are being made right now that will lock in for the future. So I think we need to pay special attention to that and those geographies and supporting leaders from those geographies, as well as recognizing the transnational institutions and decisions that enable those, particularly finance, diplomacy, and pollution efforts. So I really do feel like we're in a moment, and I'm very strangely optimistic even in these unsettling times, and but just hopeful that we can emerge from this chaos, truly choosing to build a better future.
Okay, thank you. So Beth, you have the last word before we sign off.
Well, I'll be short. I'll say the recovery needs to be green. It needs to get the economy healthy again, and it needs to be equitable. And I think we know the first two, like we know low carbon, what that looks like. We know what an economy functioning looks like to some extent. What about equitable? Like, how do we know it when we see it? And there I think about my friend Nathaniel Smith, who's the founder of Partnership for Southern Equity, who says equity is a way and not a what. And so there's something about the way that we conduct this recovery. It has to do with who's consulted. It has to do with the principle that communities should determine the infrastructure in their neighborhoods, that communities ought to get the economic benefit of the jobs that come from installing that new infrastructure. So every step of the way, from the decision to build something, to how to build it, to who builds it, to who feels the impacts and the benefits, needs to be equitable if this is going to be our shot at a green and equitable and fair transition. So that's what I would hold up. Equity is a way and not a what.
Okay, great. All right. So to our audience, thank you very much. Thank you, Beth Sarwin, Joanne Messing, and Amy Lors. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. I thought this is a great conversation. For all of you, just a reminder, the date of GPF is September 14 through 16. You're all invited to join us. It's going to be in the morning in the West Coast for 3 days in a row. We have 2 more seminars like these that are going to sort of lead us through to get prepared for that. And I wanted to thank, people at World Affairs and the Global Philanthropy Forum, Megan Kennedy and Claire McMahon. If you have questions about GPF, please feel free to contact them at globalphilanthropyforum.org. So Beth, Joanna, and Amy, if you could just stay on just for a few minutes, just wanted to, quickly debrief and thank you privately. But for all of you who've joined us, thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you at the next webinar, which is, I don't have that date, but you can go in Global Philanthropy and find out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.